Michelle.
Daniel.
OG Rose.
And today we're going to be talking about a Parallax course.
Woohoo!
That's coming up on Sunday, the 7th, so we're excited about that. You can sign up with the information, link in the description. We're really happy to be joining Parallax again for that.
Yeah, we're really excited and honored to be there. And yeah, I think something that I've been mulling over since our last conversation on belonging again to one as it relates to our Parallax course is just the question of the quotidian life and its relationship to politics. And I mean, I guess also related to the broader question of belonging again,
Right.
how to belong again when there's this potentially uncertain relationship with politics itself.
Yeah.
Like, does your vote matter or not? You know, should you be more involved?
Right.
Should you not? How should you be involved? Is it ultimately a racket? Or, you know, I mean, but it obviously has real consequences, and it's important. It matters. So,
Right.
yeah. So I guess I'm just was thinking about that because I think today we do feel this kind of almost, I want to say it almost like a moral obligation or ethical obligation. I'm not sure which really, but to sort of make a difference, right? And
Right.
advocate for positive change. But we are also kind of in this inundation of the global connectivity. So we see a lot that there's even more that we sort of feel is difficult to witness. We'd like to be different. And so what I think I don't know, at its best, we become more like empathetic and care and do things that can maybe help the world to be a better place. At its worst, I do feel like it leaves people feeling very paralyzed and yet maybe being very vocal on social media, but not knowing not being sure if that's actually helping or not.
Sure.
And but feeling this sort of overall maybe guilt of not doing enough. I don't know. So those are some thoughts because it's sort of like how do we really do politics or engage with it in a proper manner where we don't become just apathetic, but we also don't, think we're getting involved in the right way when we're just adding to the racket potentially.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, like we said last time, there's this tension between a universal project for everyone that sacrifices individuality or flattens everyone into a totalitarian sameness. But then there's also this particularist project where you're not concerned about the universal implications. But this is where it is a massive question on what changes the world. How does the world change? What changes things? Because there's also the question of what are you trying to change? Are you trying to change a particular law? Are you trying to change a particular governance? Well, you could do that and still be operating according to the same logic, quote unquote, or the same way of thinking. And what do you do if you're in an age where our problems are a result of the way that we think, like the logic itself? So, Cadell, we were talking about on this difference between kind of traditional logic, A is A, versus dialectical logic, A is B, or A is passing over into B. Basically, Belonging Again will argue that we can't really address our major problems without moving into a different logical structure. And that also, if, logic kind of carries over into everything, that would mean a different subject, a different kind of thinking, a different kind of community, a different kind of politics, a different kind of economics, and so on and so forth. So what's the difference between, what would it mean to move from AA to AB, to incubate a different way of thinking, not merely content of thinking? And that's what's kind of weird about this. This is not merely a matter of getting people the right answers. That would be kind of trivia, you have the right answers, but to change how they think about the world. Mm-hmm. Now, that sounds quite lofty, but sociology is about that all the time. How do you get people to think according to the labor form, like Marx talks about? Mm-hmm. How do you get people to think according to the symbolic of the middle class, following Pierre or other people? How do you get people to follow the quote-unquote objective fiction of race or national identity? These are all kind of metaphysical principles that are not merely content, but it transforms how you see and how you think. Now, obviously, there's some blurring here. That, you know, it is content and it is not at the same time. A, B does include A in it.
Exactly.
So
It doesn't efface it.
No, there's a kind of haziness that emerges here, but that haziness is precisely part of what keeps thought moving. Like, it keeps it in the halo, as Hofstadter talks about. It keeps it in the searching of, like, someone like a Vervaeke with dialogos and circling, or Plato, like Jockin was saying with Plato, how the rhetorical structure of thought getting to Phaedrus is kind of an intentional haziness to trying to grope out this thing that is beauty, that is beyond words. Like, if you're talking about something beyond words, then how do you talk about it? Well, it has to be kind of hazy. It has to be a kind of, I guess I've heard fluffy logic is a kind of way you hear it about. Now, fluffy logic sounds like bad logic, but it's more of a dynamic logic, a dialectical logic, a logic that doesn't settle, that's always moving precisely to keep a glimpse of beauty. Like, if beauty is something that's always moving, then you glimpse it and it's gone. You glimpse it and it's gone. And then you have to condition yourself to be able to see it again, and then it's gone. So there's something very moving about that. And so the logic is fluffy, quote unquote. It seems fluffy or fuzzy. Fuzzy logic is the term. It's fuzzy not because it's bad, but because its subject is changing and moving and conditional and dialectical. So if belonging again...
I kind of like fluffy logic.
Yeah, fluffy logic is nice, right? It's not stagnant.
That's the one about bunnies.
Yeah, but it's bunny logic. It's running around, hopping and skipping and different things. But so it's a dialectical, you know, it's kind of a dialectical logic. But of course, there's something, quote unquote, there's a fluffy logic to the dialectical, because the moment you talk about a tree, you're talking about limbs and branches and roots. It's passing over. Well, what is a tree then? If identity is always passing over into otherness, then what do we talk about when we talk about anything? Well, this is where everyone today are talking about relations, and relations are ontological. Vervaeke, you know, Wolfgang Smith, or so on and so forth. So, ultimately, there's this question of where do you change logic? Where does logic change? What is the realm in which logical constructs transform, or subjective orientation, or the way that people talk between one another? Like we were talking at the book club, the difference between the philosophical discussion that people do on these long-form, you know, philosophy podcasts or communities, these kind of discussions, these long-form discussions. What's the difference between that and the small talk or chit-chat Heidegger talks about that most people engage in? There's a difference. You know the difference when you see it. In the same way, if I ask you to describe the color red, you really can't. Like, you can't describe red except say it's red. It's a qualia. It's an experience. So the deepest,
like use reference, it's next to orange on the color wheel or whatever.
Yeah, but then that's not red. You know, you're not. Exactly. It's something that's ultimately experiential. Yeah. And so, when you're talking about onto-epistemological logical changes, you're talking about something that has to be experienced. It can't be legislated. It can't be top down. It has to be a space people enter and then they get it. Oh, now I get it. Like the first time you do a jazz improv or you're doing a music improv, now you get what improv is. Oh, now I've done it. Like once you have a garden and you do a garden, now I know what gardening is. Now I know what parenting is. There's a certain experiential. So the question is the following. Where does that kind of experience exist? It exists in the quotidian. It exists in the daily life. It exists in the small. And this is the weird thing. The only way to have people experience a different logic, a different way of thinking, is in the quotidian. But the quotidian is the daily. And so it seems very odd to be talking about like these logic paradigmatic shifts occurring in the quotidian. But, you know, part of the problem is perhaps we've thought that politics and quotidian are opposites. You know, what is, you know, what's being suggested is that might be a false dichotomy, that it's actually the shifts that occur in the quotidian that lead to the paradigmatic shifts, where all that can happen in the government or the big system level, the power level, is a reorganization of the variables within the logical construct that's already existing. Like you can move around chairs on the Titanic, but you can't switch ships. Like if you want to switch to an entirely different paradigm, that seems to happen on the quotidian, where all that happens on the big level is a movement of things around within a paradigm.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I'm thinking as you were talking, it made me wonder if we get that sense because we think of it as very almost factually top down, where it just seems like that's, like it or not, that's just how it is, like these are the laws and that's what everybody's got to do, basically. So it's like, how could you do a bottom up? Because I think of the quotidian impacting the larger society by the bottom up, right? The bottom's up, or you could say grassroots or whatever, but basically roots up. Like, it's not a cookie mold that you push down, like top down, right? I think that, I don't know, there's a part of me that wonders what could maybe shift somebody's perspective on that, because again, I think how most people experience it or think about it, or maybe that's just how we've always been taught, or we assume it to be that way, and yet there's like this underlying reality of the quotidian always informing what ultimately happens at the like law level, right, or that upper level where it seems kind of the abstract, like it's up there somewhere, right?
Well, I'm glad you said, just a note, I'm glad you said grassroots, because basically the liminal web is a grassroots movement.
Oh, it is, 100%. 100%. I guess that's the thing. I think I don't know if it's just kind of a little bit of a leap of faith, because logically, it seems to be, we're talking about shifting logic, right? But if the logic itself encloses the mindset, right? Or this is it, right? It's top down. That's why we can kind of always, even though it's obviously not, it's obviously related, law's obviously related to the quotidian, but we don't always think that the quotidian can impact it. We don't think it can go the other way around. Like, law will impact quotidian, but quotidian can't really impact law. So it's like, that's a logic right there. So, and we're talking about the logic shift happening in the quotidian.
Yes.
So then, is it sort of do you have to sort of do that jump like we talk about in 2-1 with, and it comes up with Simone Weil, where there's a sort of, it's a type of mentive divergent leap to say, well, actually, maybe it's not that logic, and everyone's like, what do you mean? There's nothing to point toward that being possible. But it's like this leap of faith to jump into the A-B logic of like, no, actually, the quotidian does impact the law. And like you said in our last talk, it's funny that people can think of it top down, because then the politicians are like, well, it's what the people want, right? Like so maybe it's just a matter of perspective. But anyways, what do you think about that? Because I do feel like there could be a little bit of a trap or an enclosure with that logic of top down, which then makes people feel helpless or impotent in their quotidian.
Well, I think that's very well put. I mean, there's a sense in which we're describing as the quotidian roots instead of the grassroots. Part of the problem is people think about grassroots as local government and then state government. You're going to petition for a law and move on the grassroots and up. There's a way in which that framing of the grassroots has removed the category of thinking of the grassroots actually starting in the kitchen, kind of the quotidian activity, like the way you act in the quotidian. There's a way in which you're almost going deeper than grassroots. You're going to like dirt. Like, what's the dirt? What's the soil in a way?
Yeah,
but I like
very fair. Yeah.
The quotidian roots. There might be some sort of term there. But basically, like, if you look through history, there's the question of what changes the world. And there's a lot of evidence that shows it has the grassroots make a big impact.
Mm-hmm.
So the book is going to talk about faithful presence of John Hunter, Dr. Hunter, which is the question of how do you change the world? And he talks a lot about faithful presence, people with certain ideas that stay faithful and present to those ideas in communities, but also are located with access to power and cultural influence. So, for example, faithful presence would be you go work in Hollywood. Like, you're in Hollywood, and there's a certain faithful presence because you're there, and just being there can influence things. So it's a kind of grassroots, but it's also a strategical grassroots. But note that it's more on the side of culture than passing a precise legislation. Like, you're not going to Hollywood because you're like, oh, I have a particular law I want to pass. I'm going to be there, which is then going to allow me to meet people and network that will then allow for there to be an influence. So faithful presence and network effects are very powerful. Now, what's interesting is now that we have YouTube and you have the ability to record videos, you actually can be present to lots of people all around the world. So what has happened now is YouTube has allowed a dynamic of faithful presence that is slightly, possibly different.
Maybe more amplified even.
It could be more amplified. It can be more amplified because it runs the risk of being more irrelevant, where it's like overwhelmed by content. But even though it is overwhelmed by content, that is the loudest plane I have ever heard. It is literally the loudest plane I've ever heard.
It's hilarious. It's not even like that low.
No,
I mean,
but
it's low, but it's not.
it is the loudest plane ever. Going over the trees now. Maybe it's like they'll be able to use it as ambient background music. The sound of the plane is like, yes.
Probably.
See the sound of the plane there. So it's very nice. But YouTube allows the possibility of the creation of cultural impact and creating communities where you're faithful present, but you then have the possibility of connections with people with influence and power. And then also, other people online who maybe have a philosophical itch can see you and then join your movement. Like, join your movement. So what's interesting is the liminal web, or these YouTube spaces, are showing the possibility of a kind of grassroots movement that is a form of faithful presence and the network effect that was not possible before the telecommunication of Zoom, and especially Zoom, not just the internet, but Zoom.
Well, I think that's why I don't disagree, but I don't know that it wasn't there still. I think faithful presence has always been actually quite potent and real.
Well, James Hunter is arguing that's always been what's changed things.
Right, it's almost like, but now we get to see it a little bit more vividly, or it's amplified in the sense that it's like, oh, like I can just think of certain things that because of the internet, people maybe would have never thought of. And sure, probably the majority still haven't changed their mind about it. That's fine. I'm not saying they need to. I'm just saying that there's certain things that people who have a faithful presence, as much as it can be derided and also like decried as something that's not ideal, just social media in general, right? But there is a way in which social media, YouTube, Zoom discussions, I know they're all quite different, we need to get into particularities, but generally an internet faithful presence, okay, that has shifted people's perspective on things that were quite solid and quite, this was what it was. And a lot of those things did feel very top down, and not even just top down, but that societally, this is what, we need to do, blah, blah, blah. So I think there's something about, and obviously there's always risks with that too, because what if everybody's wrong, right? Like, what if that shift is wrong because of that faithful presence? But if there is something about that, I really wanted to just say that as a sense that it does occur, and you can see it more vividly. I wonder if you can see it being seen more vividly is like a case for it being amplified. It's not that it wasn't there, it's just that we're seeing it at a little bit of a larger scale.
I think that's fair. I think what's interesting is faithful presence for Hunter, a way to look at you. Look, there are some, people in the Frankfurter or Gamte that talk about Marcuse maybe even, where it's this idea of the intellectual they work in a college, they teach the next generation, then those people get positions of power and it spreads and it spreads. And really, and what Hunter wants to show, and you could even say Randall Collins, is that, that's what makes the world, but it tends to have like a 30-year lag. Okay. Like the ideas of the 70s, the people who were faithfully present there have an influence on the culture in the 90s or the 2000s. And like Hunter goes through, and he's like, that's always been the case. Like the faithful presence and points of cultural influence. Now here's the issue. What happens if places of cultural influence are in decline? They don't allow faithful presence because there's no free speech as much. Like they force conformity. Well, then the mechanism of faithful presence probably is going to have to take on a different form. And what's interesting is YouTube, I'll just say Zoom because we talk about the Zoom tradition, word spread and different things. Zoom, it's almost like faithful presence has gone to the people now. Like it has gone outside the institutions precisely because the institution is more so online in a way. Like it is more of the internet and these networks that form that allow there to be a faithful presence and cultural influence. Like let's put it this way. Faithful presence, the way that Hunter talks about it, involves gatekeepers. Like, are you someone who's able to influence the gatekeeper and be a gatekeeper? Well, if gatekeeping is no more, or it's radically in decline, then faithful presence would have to be in a different manifestation, in a different form. And so that's what I think you see happening here, is faithful presence being democratized, you could almost say, or being spread more so to people who don't have a degree, but who are able to create value and stay faithful to that value and attract people to it. Now, this, in some respects, you could say, well, that may not be as effective. That may not be as effective as a faithful presence. But I don't know, Because what's interesting, and we won't know till the future, is the rate of spread that the internet allows. The rate of learning may make up for the lack of power.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yes.
colleges had a lot of power, so if you were faithfully present there and you gained power, you could have a cultural influence, but they were slow. You know, they were slow and they were exclusive. The rate of spread, the rate of creation, the rate of idea, and the transparency of YouTube or Zoom may make up for that loss of power.
Yeah. With Hunter's idea of faithful presence, did it apply to like just the quiet homemaker?
Not as much.
Okay, I just was curious. I mean,
Not
I
as
think
much.
Okay. So it's a little bit more specific to those within the gatekeeping
Absolutely.
arenas. Okay,
But,
that's fine.
but,
I was
but,
just curious.
But the quotidian and the faithful presence may come together because of Zoom.
Yeah.
Because
Well, I kind of feel. I mean, I you know Hunter's argument better than I do. But the thing is that the faithful, to me, I think a lot of it as, I don't know, maybe it's just a bias toward like the fact that I do think there's a faithful presence of just the family that makes a big impact
Sure.
on society. That is a type of faithful presence, like.
oh yeah.
In its own way, it's still a little different, obviously, but.
Well, you could say that the potential of that faithful presence could not be realized until now, because it was not able to have it. You know, it couldn't be seen. You know, it couldn't be easily integrated into a network that could create social capital. Whereas now, because of YouTube, it can be.
Yeah. Well, and also I think maybe to pair, like thinking about Hunter and Illich, like maybe
Sure.
in a way that this definition that Hunter has of the faithful presence for people in the institutions, in the gatekeeping arenas, that was afforded by often the kind of the shadow work of the
Yes.
faithful presence of families and
Yes.
you know those units and those communities and the institution itself being there.
Yes.
Those kind of establishments that were there and faithfully maintained. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
For you to have a faithful presence in those gatekeeping arenas. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, that so there's always been a coordination problem with this kind of thing, where how do you effectively coordinate value? Thinking of Mises or Hayek, and you could say that until the internet, the coordination of value was actually less efficient because it had to meet certain criteria to overcome the logistical dilemmas. Like, so for example, if you wanted to meet people who had read Hegel, you need to go to a college. The chances of you meeting people that read Hegel outside of a college are very low. But now, because of the internet, someone in Boise, Idaho, a random place, could meet someone in Europe and find there's a better coordination. You have a technology that allows better intellectual coordination, you could say, which then, if there's value there, is a better coordination of the value there, you see. So, if actually the value of the philosophical life starts in the home, it is not until now where that could be properly appreciated, because you did not have a way to directly network to the home, which the internet allows. Before, you had to have people live in a home and then go to a college. Meanwhile, they're actually secretly meeting at the Bloomsbury Group, and that's where all the value is. If you think about it, like, most of the intellectual value was created in connection with a university, but outside of it. And that's really important because it shows that the faithful presence was actually, in a way, dialectical between an inside and an outside. It's not merely inside.
Exactly.
There's a connection to the inside from a certain value creation that, funny enough, tends to happen outside.
Exactly.
So it's more dialectical.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that element of the dialectic is something that is easy to lose sight of, because Hunter, I think, Hunter in his book is critiquing, he's like really, because he does so much in sociology on American evangelicism. And there's this idea in evangelicism that if you tell people about Jesus and just spread the word, that's going to change the culture. Like just talking about it.
Yeah.
And he's like, no. Culture is changed by connections to institutions of power and cultural influence. So you have to have a faithful presence there. Like if you're not making the movies, if you're not making the ideas, and you're not in the places where you can make ideas and make movies and culture, then no, you don't change the culture.
Well, not to interrupt. I think that makes, I mean, that's good, and I see, it makes me think a little bit on rhetoric, actually.
Sure.
Right? Because, like, but the fact that rhetoric is as you use it and as McCloskey uses it, with it being dialectical between rhetoric and discourse, because the thing is, the evangelicism should work, right? It's rhetoric. We're just changing the way we talk about stuff, right? We should change the culture because we're telling people about Jesus. That should change the culture. But what that's missing is the dialectical level of the rhetoric and discourse constantly being in engagement with each other.
That's right.
And so it's that capital R rhetoric would actually be, this is an art. This is the art of being able to have the, I want to say balance, that's not probably the right word. I mean, back to dialectic with what exists, you know, with and also what you are making. Like, I think that's important with McCloskey rhetoric, where people, it is how people talk about stuff. But guess what? As soon as they really start to have this new way of talking about the produce, like that quote I read, that's when they start doing something differently. And they are making something different, which requires risk, but it will actually put something into the world that is something. It is a business, or it is a invention, or it is a whatever it is, right? It will be a book, whatever it is. And I think that's where I wonder if the evangelical, that mindset is like it's not really, it's the talking but not the doing a little bit.
Sure.
Which then might end up just fall back into discourse, into capital D, which becomes sort of an autonomous.
Well, that would be like, that's kind of Hunter's idea, is that you have to have connections with culture making and places of power in different things. If you do not, you don't make the culture, because ultimately, as belonging again to 2 we'll talk about, people are formed, not informed. They are formulated by the culture, by the signs, the unspoken, the aesthetics. That's the key term. Now, aesthetics is a tricky word to use, just like rhetoric, and can be confusion with how rhetoric is used. But aesthetics in the sociological sense does not mean merely the study of art. It is the way people see things as supposed to go together. Like, if someone is middle class, you don't expect to see them wearing jeans, driving a truck, and reading Hegel. That doesn't fit. That's not the aesthetic. And you see the issue. And so what ends up happening is people tend to live their life to conform to an aesthetic more and before they seek the right information.
But then I guess I'm just saying, if somebody heard that, when they say, isn't that contradictory to rhetoric changing everything? Well,
this is the rub, is because the question is, this is where the analysis on McCloskey, in a way, I think has to go deeper, further, because the issue is, McCloskey calls it rhetoric, when the way she's describing rhetoric is a philosophical discourse that is far more dialectical. Like, the word rhetoric it's not for her, I wouldn't say, as an economic historian, situated in this philosophical tradition of rhetoric, oration, things like that. Now, I think she wants to allude to the very art of speaking that a people have. That's not just reducible to their daily talk. Like, she's talking about the entire zeitgeist of conversation and thinking. And it's very dialectical, but she doesn't use the word dialectical because she, comes from probably at the University of Chicago, and I think she's taught there all her life. Hegelian thought is more read through Marx. So the dialectic is not seen in the way that we'll describe it. And ultimately, though, I think McCloskey's analysis suggests something like a dialectical materialism at the heart of economics, of an AB that people don't realize is there. And so the analysis does not go far enough, because the question is, well, why does rhetoric change? Now, for her, she's going to say it's a kind of emergent phenomenon of the 4 R's, like reading, reform, revolution. Like, there are cultural shifts that lead to shifts in everything. But these shifts are, they're in the aesthetic. They're in the cultural formulation. Now people are reading the Bible. They see many churches, not just one church. They see people holding books. Like, there's an aesthetic that transforms, that then functions as permission for people to think differently and spend their time differently. Because aesthetics is also permission, in a way. Like, if you start seeing middle-class people holding Hegel, then you might start associating blue jeans, truck, and Hegel together, and the aesthetic can shift. So aesthetics don't have to be solid. They just tend to be solid because they form habits and they form associations. It's very hard to break free from them. But that's why, according to 2.1, rhetoric naturally falls back into discourse. AB naturally falls into AA. It's very difficult to keep it in AB. Because you have to be able to hold something solid but loosely at the same time, a kind of open closeness. So the issue is you have to get a change in how people speak and engage with one another. But then 2.2 is going to say, but that's a result of formation. People change based on an incubator, like the environment they are in, not because they're told to talk differently. So what McCloskey is pointing out to me is it still begs the question of what are the conditions that incubate a change in rhetoric, which then in 2.1 is contrasted with discourse, like Foucault talks about as power, and that's aligned with Kafka. And so the way that McCloskey talks about rhetoric as this dialectical creative destruction, opening up of possibilities for culture, is contrasted with discourse in the Kafka sense, which is the closing up of power to think and form subjectivity in a single way. Now, the reason why it's clear that this is confusing and why we'll adjust our language is because there's also rhetoric, you could say, with a lowercase r, which is oration that people use to kind of manipulate and persuade people. And then you also have a form of discourse, which is knowing the discourse, knowing the history of thought. And if you don't know the discourse, you tend to come up with really bad ideas. But they're kind of contained within the capital R rhetoric that he's describing, because the very idea of like reading the Bible and people debating the Bible or debating the culture, well, that means they have a sense of the discourse of their society. And this really comes out too once you get to Tocqueville, because you know, for Klauski, this great enrichment starts in Holland, moves over to Britain. From Britain, it really comes to America. Well, Tocqueville talks time and time again about how the average person is so deeply civically engaged. They know the Constitution. They know the government. They're deeply engaged in civic life. So they know the discourse of the civic, if you will. But they also are going west, because they have visions of new possibilities. So there's this is the issue. The frontier went a long way to making America an open-closed society, which in a funny way is to say a dialectically materialistic society, because it's known and unknown, without people realizing it. But the problem is, this is the issue, because we have not understood the power of the dialectic, or what McCloskey is calling the rhetoric, to create wealth. Once the frontier ran out and the culture of America shifted, we weren't able to keep it. We weren't able to keep the conditions of enrichment. They got away from us, because it has a lot to do with the aesthetic formulation, the way people are formulated by the background of their culture. And in the background of America for a long time was a frontier. Like, this is in the background. So an unknown, not an unknowable, an unknown. And that unknownness is a lack. Like, culturally, there's a lack in your very national definition, of which then avoids enclosure, that then went a long way to working the American psyche. And then the problem is, but then that moved to globalization, you could argue. Like, the frontier become the spreading of capitalism, and that moves through the Cold War. That moves through, there's a spreading of American hegemony. That, in a way, is a spreading of the American frontier. You could argue it's imperialistic, but it's the notion is there's a continual spreading of a frontier. Well, what do you do now when there is no frontier? Well, now you're in the AA. You're in the discourse, so you get slow growth rates, you can stimulate demand, you can't create demand, and you get entropy. Like, there's no openness to create negentropy, so you get entropy in the system. So what you see is McCloskey is identifying a form of discussion and subjectivity that has an openness that creates wealth, but by not going into the sociological analysis of what creates that, and then pressingly what maintains that, which I think is the missing variable in all this, that's the next step in the conversation. You could say that McCloskey gives us reason to think that a dialectical transformation in subjectivity creates wealth. And then it's tied to speech, strongly tied to speech, following a Jonathan Rauch and Kindly Inquisitors, which shows that free speech goes a long way to creating ideas and testing ideas and so on and so forth, of which then changes the subject according to the frame of speech. So all of that, and then that makes sense, because the dialectical subject is psychoanalytical, and psychoanalysis has a lot to do with speaking and desire, and how desire is tied with speaking and all that. So if you're speaking about a frontier, then that creates a desire to cross it, and to be the kind of subject who can cross it. So all of that is there, and it's all connected together. But then the question is, okay, well, how do you maintain a dialectical society? Well, that would mean if it's no longer found externally in a frontier, if it's no longer, if it's only so far been kind of an event that's sort of random and then goes away, kind of similar to democracy following Sheldon Wolin, then we have to become intentional about something that so far has been a kind of unprecedented, almost uncontrollable event. And it's going to have a lot to do with turning more inward to the lack that is ontological lack, not a lack that is found in the world externally, like according to a frontier or an ocean you haven't crossed, or a belief in, if people don't believe in God in the same way, that if it's not a religious society, that provides a lack, apophatic lack, or different things. Well, if you're not going to have all of that, then this is where it will require a role of lack in the society.
Yeah, I think that was all really good. I was thinking to myself, well, is there there's kind of can be seen to be a frontier in terms of space and like going to Mars and all.
Yeah,
that.
that's what people are trying.
But do you think it's kind of different because